Okay, this is probably not the best condition for me to make this kind of recording because this topic is obviously very sensitive and requires very kind of delicate and precise treatment of these kinds of matters, which I'm really not in in my current state, in my current mood. I don't have the attention to perform that sophisticated feat, but I'm currently dealing with yeah, I mean, running into problems with my psychology theory, and that's really taking up a lot of my time. But anyway, I've been trying to. So this is maybe me thinking out loud, although I do think that I will cover a lot of cogent pieces, but they won't be collected in such a brilliantly, sort of cogent form. So this is going to be a bit of a smattering of bullet points and ideological pieces to this issue. I have reread the hate speech bill, and it is still incredibly problematic. It is actually it is almost designed to be abused, and it was obviously designed by people who don't care about non-racialism. It was essentially designed by a political party, by people in a political party that have left the ideology of non-racialism behind. They have already betrayed the Constitution. They have already murdered the Constitution. And so, they have to now create a hate speech bill that essentially fits the formula of their unprincipled and immoral worldview, their anti-racist worldview, and you can kind of see all the really the worst kinds of governmental overreach and the worst kinds of wiggle room and fudging of the moral issue is the moral laxness in how the bill is formulated. Now, this is slightly hidden. So, I mean, if anyone reads the hate speech bill, this is not going to cry out to them necessarily, but you have to perhaps have a bit of a legal background. You have to have a bit of a sensitivity to what the rule of law exactly is. And then you'll realize the depths of problem with this form of creating criminal offenses that are defined by the relativism of the subjective emotionality and psychology of the victim of the crime. So, just put this in another way, the problem with the hate speech bill, and I know that it's not just hate speech, it's also hate crime, and I mean, I guess that's also probably that has some other issues which I might bring up later, but that's really not that important. The the problem with the bill is the definition of hate. Sorry, the definition of harm. The definition of harm includes emotional and psychological harm, and then the bill also goes into describing impact assessment reports that will be done into the victims of these crimes. And the, creating an automatic sympathy to emotional or psychological trauma or emotional and psychological harm, as essentially is what is enshrined in the bill. That emotional and psychological harm, that if someone intends emotional psychological harm, and then they can say that the language used or the offensive speech relates to or mentions one of these protected grounds, which includes ethnicity, culture, color, albinism, sort of, or basically immutable characteristics. I mean, really, if you can't even structure a bill that is actually framed in terms of first principles and morality, what are you even doing? Okay, which is again the problem is that essentially the whole bill is so badly constructed that then it has to create exemptions to itself. And those exemptions are again not really quite principled. And in fact, one of the exemptions is just basically how freedom of expression is framed in the Constitution. And a freedom of expression, how that is caveated in the Constitution, essentially, it says that you can't incite imminent violence or hatred against protected grounds. So essentially, you can't defame a group or a category of people when the characteristic of that category is essentially one of the protected grounds. Okay, so sorry, I'm getting all over the place here, but the real problem and the real overreach with this bill is that it's going to end up protecting people who don't believe in non-racialism, and they are offended by language, not because not because the language used was actually offensive or derogatory to a group of people, but because it's offensive to their ideological, political worldview. Essentially, they're going to be black fascists who are going to be offended when people talk about them and who disagree with their politics and their ideology. And because they've cultivated their emotional and psychological worldview to be vulnerable and brittle, to be triggered and upset by anyone who doesn't automatically give them a wide berth and doesn't already give them the feeling of their moral superiority and concede the whole framework and let them chair the moral debate over the validity of their own beliefs, that they will be able to entrench those beliefs and protect those beliefs by saying, you have violated my emotionality, by my you have harmed my psychology by disagreeing with me. And because they themselves are so plugged into racialist consciousness and racial stereotypes and racially framing every issue, that obviously when they're being contradicted, those same things are going to be raised, those same categories are going to be mentioned, and then they'll say, well, you see, you are making sweeping generalizations. You have, I mean, their whole mentality, their whole worldview is based on this kind of cry bully, diversionary projection where they say, well, this is why we need to have our racial consciousness, is because there's so many racists like you, so therefore we have to hunker down and entrench our equality of our racial pride. We have to believe and exalt our racial pride as the only solution, because it's a negative-sum game, essentially. So you're going to have people who are going to use this legislation who are themselves racialists. They don't believe in non-racialism. And this includes a large contingent of the ANC. And the ANC itself has fundamentally repudiated the Constitution and the value and the principles of non-racialism. They have already destroyed these things. They have already destroyed them in legislation itself. The Promotion of Equality Act, 2008. In terms of how even their black economic empowerment legislation and affirmative action operate, these are all very divisive, toxic, racialist ways of implementing policy that are fundamentally unconstitutional, and in which the Constitutional Court won't even say whether they are unconstitutional or not, because they say that there's a governmental prerogative, that essentially the government is allowed to redefine the value of non-racialism. And the government has taken this blank check they've doubled down on it. They've taken it to Wall Street. They have, they've turned it into an ideological cash cow in which they have now entrenched a whole generation's worth of vulnerable narcissism and entitlement and toxic self, this weird, because what happens when you have a policy that fundamentally treats people like tokens of their group, and then you criticize such a disgusting policy and such a disgusting racialist worldview and consciousness, and such a cynical and, quite frankly, this is not morally different from apartheid. This is the same moral argument. It's just in a slightly different it's just being deployed in a slightly different type of policy, but it's the same moral framing of the issue, essentially. It's the same racialism, but a different kind of moral authoritarian now doing it, and also that has subverted and undermined the constitutional order. Very disgusting. But anyway, so you can't also have a crime which is essentially completely up to the victim's sentiments and the victim's. What happens if the victim is not reasonable in their emotional distress, is not reasonable in their emotional trauma? The whole thing, even I would say, on a weird fundamental level, invalidates non-racialism even more, because it says essentially that we're not equal until there is some kind of equal outcome of that somehow the world has to be representative of some quantitative imprint of the equality of people. So it's like, it's this really strange kind of social engineering. Like it really puts politics and the law in a very strange position where, it used to be that if you swore in a school, or if you used derogatory words in a school, that you could be suspended from school, you would be reprimanded, you would be punished for breaking the code of conduct of the school. And now we're going to transition that into, well, we're going to ask the country, what words do you find derogatory? What words do you find offensive? And if there's going to be a good enough consensus, a good enough general consensus on certain things, then we're going to implement this kind of groupthink, this group morality. I mean, it's really backwards. I mean, where is the principle in this? And so you really have to rethink all of this, because how the reason why I'm bringing up these kinds of issues, or why I just said what I just said, is not because, yes, obviously when people use derogatory words, it's not nice. But if you're going to criminalize something, you have to base it on a principle, and you have to scale up that principle, and you have to make sure that things actually function on a fundamental level, that it actually works. And this is essentially, this is an unprincipled test. Like, do people subjectively find something offensive? That's not a good enough legal test. We already have criminuria. It's already illegal to insult someone, basically, and harm their character and their dignity. Dignity is already a legally protected entity. The courts can understand, and it's them to investigate the context of what things mean, and those sorts of things. What we really needed, we do need to have law against hate speech, and it needs to primarily combat people like Julius Malema. It needs to deal when people are essentially making blanket accusations and blanket conspiracy theories that essentially morally indict a whole group of people, or when people are being stereotyped. I mean, en masse. I mean, this, on racial grounds or whatever immutable characteristic, you can't talk in terms of blanket accusations against immutable characteristics. I mean, this is utterly contemptible. I mean, this is essentially, this is propaganda for genocide. I mean, it's arguable that it's essentially, it's an international war crime, essentially, and in some sense, hate speech in this sense needs to be criminalized, in that you don't want to be on the path to generating, to leading up to essentially normalizing what will become war crimes if this stuff gets out of control, if it spirals, and I mean, this is like the democracy that gets boiled like the frog in water. Um, so that's the kind of thing that we need hate speech for. We need a restriction on especially political speech. But I mean, there have been many ANC officials who themselves, I think, have crossed this line, um, because they are essentially the party that has a lot of doublespeak around non-racialism. They pretend to understand what non-racialism is, but they have completely murdered it. I mean, they have so much doublespeak on this issue. It's really quite pathetic. Um, okay, so the the real principle around all of this is, uh, I mean, just to make it as broad as possible, and just that hate speech needs to be geared around this kind of moral formulation. Unfair discrimination targeting immutable characteristics. So if someone makes a public utterance, uh, if someone is essentially defaming or incriminating or uh, insulting a group of people where the essential feature of that group of people is an immutable characteristic, and that the thing being said essentially is essentially an unfair is unfair in some way, and it relates to some kind of discrimination. And you have to be very careful here, because there are a lot of things that might um, fall into this category. That, I mean, comedy would be an obvious example. When people say things in comedy, they don't exactly mean them. Um, it's not like literally the thing that they are inciting. It's just it's perhaps an absurdity. It's a way of framing something that puts something in a juxtaposition. So you have, um, and I'm using even the word discrimination quite broadly here, because I mean, first of all, to think is to be a discriminator. When one is thinking about any subject, one is making discrimination about a particular subject matter. So the point is that it's not that we're not allowed to make distinctions and discrimination about a topic. It's that the discrimination should not be unfair. And there are some forms of discrimination which are certainly fair. And we've lost all sight of this when we went straight into the so-called anti-racist, anti-sexualist version of identity politics, and we left behind non-racialism and non-sexualism, which, for example, that we say, well, somehow all firefighters are sexist if we don't have 50% female firefighters and 50% male, uh, like that kind of sort of crazy stuff, where if you actually put women through any kind of qualitative testing, you'll find that on average, women have a lower lung capacity, which means that they're much more vulnerable to smoke inhalation and to being overpowered by, they have less surface area on the inside of their lungs, essentially. And this is why we have female firefighters that have died, because they have been given jobs that, quite frankly, they should have never been allowed to enter into those professions. Uh, and that's because we haven't allowed for fair discrimination. We haven't said you don't meet the standards, you don't meet the criteria, so you can't become a firefighter. And it doesn't matter that there aren't 50% female firefighters and 50% male firefighters. It's just not. is just not feasible, essentially. So that would be an example of fair discrimination. And one would also perhaps argue that if someone made generalizations, because I mean, again, this is the issue about generalizations. Generalizations are essentially, it's probably quite easy to make a true generalization, because what is the definition of a true generalization? That what it applies to the majority of cases. It applies to 50% plus 1, and then is the generalization true then, if it applies to 50% plus 1? So, I mean, what is the value of statements made, generalizations made, when they are applicable to 50%, at least 50% plus 1? I mean, how useful is such a claim? How useful is such a so-called piece of knowledge? So, I mean, there might be true generalizations, but it's going to be quite risky to use those as factors and pieces of knowledge in any decision-making process. It's going to be very morally murky to do so. So if people want to have fights over generalizations, I really think that they're already fighting over the bottom of the barrel kind of intellectualism, because who cares? Because anyone who is using a generalization to inform their decision making is an idiot, is being utterly stupid, in the same way that racists are stupid, in the same way that sexists are stupid. Because there's no point in, I mean, how inexact is your worldview at that point? I mean, I mean, you really have to be on some level of, you have to be on some spectrum of imbecile to think that you can do this, which is also why it's imbecilic that we have the Promotion of Equality Act that uses race as a proxy for disadvantage. It's utterly contemptible. It's also no surprise that we have no development in our country, and that the transformation that we have is such a hollow and essentially is a thinly veiled disguise to facilitate politically connected oligarchy, and why we have so much general corruption, is because we have this kind of moral depravity that has already been used as the basis of our law. And so I mean, I can say intellectually it's stupid, but morally it's also corrupt. It's moral corruption, because it's using racialism, and it's using anyway. But that's a slight tangent. So, and I mean, that's really the level at which that this kind of hate speech legislation is trying to stand up for people, is trying to say, no, no, no. We can use positive generalizations if we are allowed to abandon non-racialism, and we are allowed to go black consciousness, black pride, the black identity, yes, 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 all of these things. We must promote all of these things, because that's how equality happens now. That's our racialist consciousness version of trying to achieve equality. And if anyone tries to dampen our black consciousness project, then we're going to say that they are committing hate speech. And if anyone reacts to our black consciousness project and our fascism, essentially, and our neo-chauvinism and our neo-apartheid, and all of this moral murkiness, now we've got the tool to crack down on them. So, as soon as you've got, I mean, this is going to be the biggest problem of the legislation, is that it is going to essentially create a political orthodoxy, because the Constitutional Court has essentially already de facto allowed the government to redefine non-racialism, by saying that there's a governmental prerogative, and not even willing to constitutionally test the constitutionality of the Promotion of Equality Act. And now the government will be able to continue its racial consciousness project and its undermining of non-racialism. And anyone who speaks out against it, they will have the legal arsenal to say that you're perpetrating hate speech, because what you're doing is emotionally harmful and psychologically harmful against people who want to be treated as tokens of their racial identity category. They want to affirm their racial identity. And if you then give them a countermanding generalization, so they've already given up their own dignity. I would argue that they've already sacrificed their own dignity as individuals, because now they see themselves as a racial category, but they're not willing to, and they want to talk about how their racial category only looks like it's been bad because of history and because of oppressors and because of white privilege has changed. So they've got all this ideological racialist dogma and worldview, and they're basically, I would call them fascistic, black fascist worldview consciousness, and they want to be insulated from having hate speech raining on that parade, raining on that disgusting political betrayal of the new South African constitutional order and also democracy. These are people who, even in the ANC, it's no, it's no mystery that these people, they don't like the Constitution. They have made it very plain that they don't like the Constitution. They don't like non-racialism. They have made that very plain. They don't believe in the Madiba magic. That's what they say. They say Mandela is not. They repudiate the moral message of Mandela. They repudiate the moral message of the South African Constitution. They have already betrayed it. But now they will get protection from the hate speech bill because their emotions and their psychological structure, which is plugged into the black fascist racial consciousness, will say that no, you're making me feel bad. You're making my emotional and psychological, you're harming my emotional and psychological state by invalidating my political ideology. So how does that square? There's no way to stop what I'm saying because there is no objective, substantive, principled measure in the hate speech bill, because harm is merely defined by the victim, by the relativism of the victim, and by, let's say, whatever context or whatever literalist interpretation that you want to do to the actual exchange. So you can just take things out of context then, and you can remove the political context, and even though the person who so-called committed hate speech can say, well, actually, I said these things, but they were germane because these were the topics that were raised by the other person. That they were using their generalizations and they were using their racial consciousness, and I was just deflating their racial consciousness, which, already these people, I would argue, are morally beyond the ambit of the Constitution, but they're going to rely on hate speech and supposedly this legislation, which supposedly falls in line with the Constitution, that frames everything in the relativism of the victim. Now, this is the reason why I'm making this recording, is because this is emblematic of the authoritarian corruption of our times. This is when you demand an automatic intellectual sympathy to someone's emotional state, then you allow them to propagate their emotional or psychological structure to be brittle and vulnerable in such a way that they end up manipulating and controlling culture and now the law itself, and interfacing and getting their sentiments to be protected by law and to be enshrined by law merely because they have included in their own psychological schema their identitarian, chauvinistic worldview and ideology. So I mean, it's a kind of like it's a takeover, and the worst thing is that the gap will be filled in by the courts. So the judges that have this racial consciousness and ideology, which they already developed, in not constitutionally testing the Promotion of Equality Act, now will continue to evolve into rationalizing and normalizing this fascistic worldview and politics. But so it basically means that the political sentiments of whoever is judging the case will be able to interpret and impose the moral stricture that is inherent in or innate in their ideological worldview. And so you get this kind of this hidden authoritarian cultural sentiment which completely merges the executive function and because in some sense this law cannot be interpreted in an objective way. It can only be interpreted by someone who has a kind of a political baggage that is going to I'm phrasing this really quite poorly. Because essentially, at some point, it's basically it's fudged. The issue is fudged because at some point the harm itself. At what point do you say that this person has not been harmed by the hate speech? They have in fact been harmed by their own psychology. They have been harmed by their own political ideology and worldview. That they have not been given offense, that they have taken offense. And they have taken offense because of their own disgusting worldview and toxic ideology. So you see, there's no sensitivity to this in the hate speech legislation. So whose ideological standard is going to win the day? And already the ideological standard of the Constitution of non-racialism has already been betrayed by the courts, essentially, who have turned a blind eye to it and said, well, there's a governmental prerogative, and now this legislation itself does not lay out these basic things. Again, there's no definition of fairness in terms of discrimination, which is given in as part of the legal test that is, I mean, in some sense, there's no legal test here. The legal test is, what does the victim say? How did the victim take it? And the victim is not responsible for how they took it. It's only responsible for reporting to the court how they took it. And then how they took it gets criminalized onto the perpetrator, onto the person on the other side. So this is, it leaves us nowhere. It's a nebulous, you can't frame a crime in terms of the relativism or the subjective point of view of the victim. It's not, it's just not feasible. I mean, I would say that even breaks the rule of law, because that's literally going to be interpreted. People are just given a free, a blank check to take as much offense as they wish to take. And their academic freedom, that's the other thing, is that the exemption that is given to academics is, quite frankly, I find that offensive, and that is also because I would argue that academics already have breached the limits of academic freedom in essentially trying to propagate hatred towards immutable characteristics. In terms of these race and gender studies classes and things like that. And so, again, this legislation provides no ammunition to actually protecting the morality of the Constitution. It also, in terms of how it wants to enhance prevention of hate speech and hate crimes, it says that people should be reminded of the prohibition. If you really wanted to prevent hate crimes, you would actually morally educate people in terms of non-racialism, but obviously that would be a non-starter for the ANC government, because the ANC does not want people to believe in non-racialism. They want their racial politics. That's the only thing keeping the party together, probably. Um, so it just shows you kind of how backwards all of this stuff is. Okay, but let me make this point about the academics. Um, I should talk about them, but let me actually move on. There was another issue that I skipped over that I want to return to. Um, but yeah, the Constitution itself talks about two things. It talks about essentially instigating hatred, and it talks about inciting imminent violence. The hate speech bill talks about harm, which it defines in incredibly broad terms. So it says inciting harm. It doesn't talk about hatred. It doesn't elaborate on essentially instigating hatred. So it really is essentially around elaborating criminaluria into essentially racist insults. That's really what it's designed for. It's designed for literally policing speech and wanting to create essentially a list of derogatory words and policing speech, so that there's the sense that politicians have a kind of have some kind of role in policing culture, but also um, let me just find. I was just talking about this with someone. That it's their job to manufacture cultural dogma and to sort of condense the problem of the human condition into a zero sum social psychology. That the problem with the reason why we're not achieving equality or something like that is because the problem is that we have to overcome these hurdles of social psychology that people have tacked onto their identities. And instead of helping them get out of that problem, which is a conceivably, in terms of one's contemplating of it, is a conceivably plausible problem to have, instead of using non-racialism to get yourself out of that mind prison, instead they're going to play the game of toxic racial consciousness and trying to bring equilibrium to the identities, so that they can kind of create a never-ending war. And as part of mediating that cultural war, they are going to say that these are the naughty words, that these are the derogatory words that you're not allowed to use, so as to protect the collective identity and the collective pride of different groups. So they are really trying to seed a kind of cold war between identities, between racial consciousnesses. Very, very toxic. Instead of actually making hate speech legislation that has any kind of principled edifice. It's all just based on if people can take offense or not. Never mind that if they're taking offense, essentially because they are themselves toxic racialists. You know, the law makes no differentiation between such so-called victims, and so there's going to be a whole economy of victims who will be professional victims, as we can already see in this toxic culture that we have of this toxic identity politics. And you can even see politicians playing into that. Okay, so because it's a wonderful diversion for them. So you can see that the framing of the bill um, is really creating a nebulous moral gauntlet. It's creating a lot of moral confusion, so that confusion can essentially be imposed or be filled in by a kind of cultural soft power of let's say decentralized cultural sentimentality. So as long as there's enough people in the country who say that, yeah, these are the naughty words and these are the okay words, or that this is the okay political ideology, and it doesn't matter, you know, if you're racialist or not racialist, that essentially, if there's enough groupthink on one side, then the court essentially can now be empowered with this nebulous, moral, unprincipled framework to enthrone the mob, to morally endorse the mob, or to be a reflection of the mob's power in the legal structure and the legal framework. So, I mean, this is the kind of moral and legal positivism which you see always in a kind of, usually it's you know, I mean, the fascists will always say we make the law. You know, we just make whatever structure we want, and you know the actual people who want things to work in principle get very upset when you know essentially the whole thing doesn't even hang. It's not cohesive. It doesn't even work on the level of thought. It's unsustainable. Because it doesn't even conserve what it's even defining within its own terms. It just falls apart. You know, it just becomes a semantic game, and then, well, you know, what does this word mean and what does that word mean? Well, then you can just ask the mob what they, and they'll tell you. And so it doesn't matter if you actually got these things to cohesively hang together. You can just rely on the group sentiment, on the group morality. So this keeps on reminding me of other points which are really not really relevant to this, but essentially, yeah, it's when basically you've got something that should be governed by hard rules and hard structure within the confines of policy and legislation, that is instead being outsourced to a kind of cultural soft power. So you've got something that's being decided over by a kind of a loose general consensus of soft power when it should be governed by hard structures and an actual rigorous legal tests and requirements. And so you can see that the legislation is crafted so badly that you've got an overreaching criminalization of things, and then you've got a list of exemptions, and then they will be able to interpret who falls into those exemptions and who doesn't. And people who ideologically agree with whichever way the wind blows that helps them, then they'll take that rationalization and interpretation of what was said. I mean, it's a huge government overreach, and the worst thing about it is that it doesn't do anything about the actual hate speech, which is in some sense uh, largely condoned within the current political arena. You know the and you know and within the mainstream media that quite frankly does not care because their racial consciousness ideology already leads them towards much more radical conclusions and concessions, and essentially, I mean, these are people who are quite frankly, if there was a genocide that would help reach a kind of equilibrium between the moral standing of the different categories of people, they might even be, quite on board with that. I mean, famously, um, Eusebius McKaiser said on the radio, on public radio, where he's still paid to have a public radio show. Um, I'm not calling for a genocide, but I'm saying that if there was a genocide, it wouldn't be unjustified. So he can actually say that if there was a genocide, it wouldn't be unjustified. He can say that on public radio, and that's not hate speech. That's absolutely fine. That's a fair comment, I guess, to some people's ideological worldview. And I mean, there's so much sort of disinformation that comes with the black fascistic worldview, um, which also, if you debunk any of that stuff, if you talk about those factoids which are often trotted out, about um, the land distribution in this country and things like that, and the wealth distribution in this country, which, when we were having the fake land reform debate, I call it fake because it's built on so much falsehood, and quite frankly, it very consciously tried to blame the Constitution for its lack of restitution, for the lack of actually delivering land reform. They said that, oh, it's the Constitution's fault why we haven't had proper land reform, not because the land reform has been funded twice and the money has been stolen twice, not because of theft within the process and because of mismanagement of the process, but somehow it's the Constitution's fault for not allowing for expropriation without compensation explicitly. I mean, it's just, the level of subversion, the level of, and then also they use land audit numbers that are like close to 20 years out of date. So why are they using old land audit numbers? So that they can generate a whole slew of fake statistics. And there's so many problems. It's just anyway. So I would argue that the government itself has already essentially um, perpetrated consciously a racial narrative and tried to propagate hatred, racialist hatred. But I mean, in some sense, that's all the ANC has holding itself together. Because if it can't divert the blame for its own mismanagement and irresponsibility in leadership, then you know, uh, you know, they say transparency and sunlight is the best disinfectant. Well, I would say responsibility is the best disinfectant, and the inability for a government to actually say that we are responsible for the governance of a country, and to divert that blame onto a minority and say, oh, well, these people are holding us back or something like that. I mean, which is essentially the pretext of all the affirmative action and black economic empowerment legislation, which again fails to transform the country because it basically exists to enrich politically connected black elites who have been enriched, but the country cannot sustain that kind of parasitism, cannot sustain that level of artificial so-called transformation that, quite frankly, is taxing on every system. It's like a double tax, but then it works even worse than that, because it essentially means that there isn't enough money to actually have legitimate growth, and authentic ladders of development never get built because the system itself is dying, it's shrinking. I mean, entrepreneurs can't exist in this system where you can't network with people organically, because you have to look at everyone's racial credentials, and as soon as you start dealing with someone who is black, then at some point they're going to be headhunted, and so you won't be able to do business with them anymore. It's this artificial quota system on the labor market has essentially destroyed the functioning of how markets are supposed to function. So many people that I know of have literally left the country, not because just because of the disruption of their employment, because they can't retain employees. As soon as they give someone work experience and they give them credentials, essentially, because they become skilled professionals, they get headhunted. Because there's an ideological price on there's an ideological premium on black professional labor. And so you get this artificial, you could call it inflation of credentials as well, because that means that also, when I say inflation, I mean the efficacy is inflated. So when someone has a credential, you don't even know if you can trust it as well, because you don't know if that person was acceleratedly promoted. Credentials lose their meaning, but also because of the ideological premium on people's on people's labor, you've got a huge distortion and impediment to the organic functioning of the labor market. And so we have destroyed the third pillar of the economy. We have destroyed small and medium businesses, because small and medium businesses cannot compete with this kind of headhunting and red tape and quota and counting. And most people in proper functioning economies, they get their first job from a small or medium business. They don't get employed by big companies. And so we have a very distorted view of capitalism and a very distorted view of the free market, frankly, because it's been poisoned by ideologues and by racialists, essentially. But I mean, this is how the market functions. So essentially, politically connected people can force their way into managerial positions, force their way into equity, because the company has to have a certain percentage of its shares owned or directed or managed by someone who is black. And so it doesn't matter if this black person is already rich, is already, well established. That doesn't make a difference. It doesn't matter if there's one black person who owns 51% of the entire economy. It just matters that the tokenism of that it's black owned. It doesn't matter how many. It doesn't matter if they were disadvantaged before. It doesn't matter if they've actually, been developed in any way. If they're adding value, or if they are, it's just. I mean, this is a kind of taxation. This is a kind of ideological taxation, but it's also of the unsustainable variety, because this is just weighing down the system, and it weighs it down so much that the system can't grow organically. And so you'll just divide the pie that already exists. You won't grow the pie to include people, and you won't, also, when you don't have growth in capitalism, you have a very big problem, because when there's no growth, there's no free money flowing into market opportunities, and into developing new. So we literally have so much stagnancy and so much death within the economy, so much zero sum reallocation, so much redistribution, that there is no organic, pragmatic investment into things that would make a huge difference into people's lives at the lower end of the economy. We're not getting the organic ladders of success. We're not getting, you know, or that's being horribly uh, diminished and pressured essentially by the large scale demise and cannibalization, the racialist cannibal. Yeah, so the racialist ideology and the economic cannibalization based on racialist lines, which fail to even look at the amount of, I mean, if you look at salaries, the amount of the majority of salaries that are paid out in South Africa are paid to black people. So I think that there is a bit of a lie that the economy is as disproportionate. I mean, people have even said that within the black population there is a bigger difference between poor and rich than there is between black and white. And all of these new facts are kind of swept under the rug because they break the racialist narrative, which the ANC is now solely dependent on, and which, I imagine is going to be part of the political orthodoxy, which is going to be um, policed with this hate speech legislation. It could very easily become a tool of authoritarianism and political repression. Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent. Let me go back. So the soft power and the hard power analogy, I think, is a this is a thesis. I mean, this is how authoritarianism often sort of disguises itself as well. Is that you've got things that should be governed by principles being governed by a kind of cultural mob think or group think, and then you've got so the soft power of culture is displacing what should be the rule of law, and which we've already kind of in the South African context has already been corrupted and institutionally corrupted uh, from even the apex court, from the constitutional court, has betrayed non-racialism in the constitution. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that the hate speech legislation will actually be an actual proper instantiation where this kind of the soft power of people's emotional and psychological sensibility and sentiments is going to be used as is going to be dressed in the garb of the hard power of the state and the legal framework. And this is a fundamental contradiction. These things are not meant to kind of be touching or I mean, there are issues which kind of deal with both of these things, but they have to be very clearly delineated. Whereas here they are completely confused and mixed up. I mean, the biggest thing in the bill itself, it talks about in the public interest. Now, who is to and this is the biggest problem. Who interprets what is in the public interest? Can't an individual member of the public determine that it's in the public interest? So, I mean, who is the court of what is in the public's interests? I mean, that is something which freedom of speech itself as a principle is essentially saying it's in the realm of the individual. It's in the realm of the individual to litigate that in the mediating court of culture itself, not culture um, obviated by uh, some section of popular sentiment, or some loose consensus on what is considered derogatory, or um, okay. Now the reason why I just kind of tripped myself up in what I was just saying just now is because I do think that there is a place for hate speech legislation. I do think there is a place to have some, essentially, you could even call it an ideological. I mean, I'll steel man against my own position. A kind of ideological virtue test or something like that. But I think it's quite justifiable, not because it's a test for virtue, but because essentially to break this kind of rigor or stricture is to do dangerous things to the structure of the polity. And in some sense, in the South African context, this damage has already been done. But essentially, that you shouldn't have a hate speech bill or a hate speech legislation. What you should have is you should have the promotion of non-racialism and non-sexualism, the education and promotion of non-racialism and non-sexism. I don't know what the word is, non-sexism or non-sexualism. It doesn't really matter, I guess. But this is very tricky, because I think that in some level, government must realize the limits, the natural limits that it must concede to, that it cannot have such an active hand in shaping the culture and policing people's freedom of speech. And so, even though that there are certain things that are morally wrong, that they should not be essentially unlawful. So it's not all hate speech that should be unlawful. It is, but there are some lines that certainly should not be crossed. And I think that some of these lines are essentially um, any kind of thought leader, any kind of institution, or any kind of, so politicians are leaders that I think should have a higher standard of when they speak about certain issues. And also professors and people who are, and so all of those types of people, I think, I don't think that they should have necessarily different rules. I think that you could frame this within the promotion of non-racialism or whatever, and that there should be teeth to. So if you have a piece of legislation that says that for the education and promotion of non-racialism and non-sexism, that then you also have prohibitions against people making certain kinds of certain kinds of statements and utterances that breach certain moral principles and certain precepts. And now, let me just talk about why this should not really apply to average people or normal people within even their own social media. First of all, I don't think the people that actually care about, that they supposedly care about hate speech, even would want that stuff to be properly policed. And I mean this quite, I think that they're all hypocrites. I think that they're all liars and deceivers and hypocrites, and they haven't thought, or if they're not overtly hypocrites, they haven't even thought about it themselves for very long. In Twitter in South Africa, there was a trending hashtag, kill all men. How is that not hate speech? People who promoted this hashtag, kill all men. So, and I mean, this is the big problem with, supposedly taking to arms and taking to task some people for their hate speech, when the person who is instigating that litigation or who has made the criminal complaint is themselves a feminist. And let me not mince words, feminists are not non-sexualists. They don't believe in equality. They use the equality, diversity, and inclusion triad because they want equality of outcome. They don't care about equality of opportunity. They are themselves quite overt partisan chauvinists. And the only way that they get away with this is that they just cry being the victim all the time. They just complain how victimized they are, and then they can justify kill all men. And then they don't want to hear anything that derails their very fragile worldview, which takes no responsibility, and which is, they've cast typed themselves as the victim. So, it's ironic that a lot of these people who have vulnerable identities are, I would say, part of the psychological economy of making those identities uh, in a kind of in some kind of narrative worldview, making them. I mean, this really has to do with narcissism and entitlement, but essentially making them out to be a kind of vulnerable narcissist, so that they are themselves sacred victims, essentially, and therefore the whole narrative has to be mediated with them at the center of that moral universe, where they are elevated in their victim status. And which is another terrible thing, which is what the current hate speech legislation does, is that essentially it creates a perfect receptacle for these kinds of vulnerable narcissists, and borderline personality disordered women are going to go to town on this. I mean, it's going to exacerbate mental health problems, because it's literally going to create a way for them to capture attention, and it's going to create a feeding frenzy, as it were. It's going to create a beautiful lever of social manipulation and control, which, if you know anything about borderline personality disorder, you know that they can't let go of such levers, and they won't be able to stop themselves from continually extracting from them. So there's that problem as well. But so I mean, let me give an example. So when Julius Malema makes the kinds of inflammatory remarks that he makes, which are kind of like blanket accusations and generalizations, there's no one that can stand up against him, against that kind of racial mongering, because even if you contradict that line, then you're making another generalization about a group of people. So that's the problem, is that denying his narrative helps reinforce it into some degree, because it's saying, no, that isn't the right generalization about white people. This is another generalization that is more true. The point is that he should either have to prove his conspiracy theory, or he should not be allowed to make those kinds of remarks where he is indicting a whole group of people. Or, he will put in some caveat sometimes. He will say, there are some whites are not like this, but most are, or something like that. These are kinds of remarks that are made by Tito Mboweni. They're all in this toxic racialist hate mongering, because they need identity consciousness. That's what their politics runs on. That's the only thing that helps divert attention from their own ineffectual mismanagement and poor track records and such. Is they need to divert blame. They can't take the disinfectant of responsibility onto their own shoulders. It's always a conspiracy theory of some kind or another. And so if you make a conspiracy theory, a racial conspiracy theory, you either have to prove it as part of your defense against why it's not hate speech, so that when you are actually being prosecuted for incitement to hatred, based on immutable characteristics, that then you actually have to actually make your case that it is actually accurate, the comment that you made. And a generalization can never be accurate. By definition, a generalization cannot be accurate. So I would say already it's kind of morally an impossible, it's already a flagrantly reckless type of comment to make, a generalization. Or a generalization that impugns the character of the people that are doing something, or the character of the people that make up the generalization. I guess you can make generalizations that are talking about structural or systemic implications. But again, those need to be sanitized of not providing any kind of moral commentary on the people that so I mean, as an intellectual point or something like that. But I mean, the race and gender studies people are very crafty at having their cake and eating it, and having these double standards and having these two sets of filtering reality. They have a very selective sort of bias in how they construct their statistics, and they don't ever try to falsify their own modeling of these things. It really is just a mountain of assertion and conjecture, which in those assertions, those assumptions that are used as the basis of making their models and making their claims, are themselves deeply steeped in a kind of in a prejudiced and in a racial consciousness. So anyway, there's and again, I mean, I really, this is what I would expect hate speech legislation to tackle. These are the kinds of issues, and probably the American bill on restricting the teaching of critical race theory in the military academies has a moral, principled formulation of, it says basically books and authors and ideas or whatever that fit this bill, that make moral criticisms of people based on immutable characteristics, or and it also has other criteria there, but that I think is the general principled one. And if you're morally impugning someone's character based on an immutable characteristic, I mean, you're a fascist basically, but also that you're committing constitutional damage. You're undermining the value of non-racialism and non-sexism, or some other protected group, most probably. So I mean, that would be an example of impugning the moral character of someone based only on the fact that they share an immutable characteristic is obviously unfair discrimination, is obviously a case of unfair discrimination. But if you want to generally broaden this into the broadest principle, is that unfair discrimination for an immutable characteristic is unconstitutional. That's the general sort of thing. And people do have a duty to the Constitution, but in some sense, you can't enforce people, necessarily private individuals, to forego their freedom of conscience. And in some sense, the state has a duty to try to be something of a bar against the corrosion of the moral fabric of the democracy, which has already largely happened, but largely because the ANC itself has subscribed to racialist rhetoric and racialist ideology and policy. Um, but what are you going to do with feminists? You're not going to be able to say, well, you're actually propagating hate speech when you say kill all men, and it doesn't matter, that so your excuse is that you've got this narrative, and you don't want to hear anyone giving you a counterfactual narrative. So in how you drown out the counterfactual narrative is that you have to make hysterical claims like kill all men, so that people know that you're serious, so that when you tell people to shut up when they're contradicting your narrative, your victim narrative, that you've got the fireworks to back you up, essentially. And that is how people entrench themselves in their toxic ideological worldview, where they say, well, if you contradict me, you're harming my emotional state, you're harming my psychological state. If you disagree with me, is because they're allowed to elevate the issue. They're allowed to say kill all men, but if you disagree with them, you have to show that you were psychologically harmed. Whereas the decent people, the non-racialists and the non-sexualists, aren't psychologically harmed by this. I mean, you could say that it is slightly alarming to be part of a culture, to be part of a society that misunderstands its own constitution and that has betrayed its own fundamental moral fabric to such a large extent, and that flagrantly, gives play to these people, and that when you want to take them to court for hate speech, they'll say, well, you're not emotionally harmed, you're not psychologically harmed, you're just intellectually offended by these people, and so you can't sue them, or you can't make a criminal complaint against them, but they can make a criminal complaint against you because their psychology is built on being so brittle and vulnerable that if they don't get their way, then you are harming them by not letting them feel like they have the only valid position, which is essentially the mentality of an authoritarian. So, we are literally giving out blank checks of emotional harm to authoritarians, to borderline personality disordered women, to, you know, uh, uh, demagogues, and because I'm sure Julius Malema will use hate speech. I mean, he will. I'm sure he will make claims against other people making hate speech against him, and then you'll see the monstrous ideology of how, well, he is the face of black consciousness, or something like that, or that he is the righteous inheritor of the mantle of, sort of the hope of the black identity to rise, or something like that. I mean, you might even use it as the mechanism to which to lead towards a more forthright development of the Führer principle in contemporary South African politics, because you can see that the Führer principle already exists thematically, but it hasn't been consciously, explicitly developed, and this might be one of the steps towards that. I really do think that this hate speech legislation is potentially the portal through which the fully formed demonic Führer principle is going to become explicit. I really see that happening, because it's got all the unprincipled elements set on the table, just waiting for someone to hold a feast and to do work with them. And so, I mean, I am really anticipating that. But yeah, so my general point is that we already have criminuria, and this legislation has actually been very stupid in not actually, it hasn't even given people any extra tools to go against people like Julius Malema for his political statements, because essentially the only way that you can, because it hasn't elaborated on the instigation of hatred and the propagation of hatred. It has not defined hatred in terms of and essentially it really centers around the harm of the victim. So it doesn't do anything even about standing up for the principle of non-racialism. And because of this lapse as well, because it's completely silent on the education or the promotion of the values and the principles of non-racialism in action, it's it's really quite a vacuous, but also potentially very dangerous and very prone to political abuse. Um, it really is an overlap between politics and culture, which is very reminiscent of fascistic states or just authoritarian states in general. It would make much more sense if this was all centered around the propagation or instigation of hatred for immutable characteristics. And I mean, even the Constitution itself it frames harm as imminent violence. And also in not defining hatred, it really relies on the fudged, unprincipled framework of identity politics. It really, opens the door to all of that. And I mean, obviously, because these principles and values have already been so badly damaged within contemporary South African polity, but also within the legal structure. Um, within that context, uh, essentially the government has already politicized non-racialism with racial politics. That sounds a bit like a mouthful, but that's exactly what's happened. It's already redefined non-racialism in a racialist way. And so because hatred is just defined loosely, or it's not defined at all really within the hate speech bill, it's just that it's loosely connected with a listed protected category. So if you're speaking, if the subject of your speech seems to relate to one of these protected groups or protected categories, it doesn't make a test of the content, it just makes a test of what the content is correlated, is just loosely correlated to, so I mean, like the actual, One wonders how strict the courts are going to be at delineating in someone's speech if the criticism doesn't attach to the protected category or group, but if the criticism actually attached to a tendency that was being encouraged, or a trait which was being, I mean, I often talk in my recordings about how the policy of the Promotion of Equality Act essentially promotes racial consciousness and promotes a kind of black entitlement and black consciousness and chauvinism. Now, it's not clear to me that the kind of statement does not fall under essentially the incitement of hatred. In terms of how the bill is framed, especially when essentially the most pivotal function here is how that is emotionally or psychologically received by someone. So, I mean, the biggest problem is that the phrase caused harm, or I mean, the idea that someone has caused harm, assumes that someone's psychological or emotional structure is deserving of dignity. And some people's worldview, some people's ideological, political, or racial consciousness, quite frankly, do not deserve protection. So, I mean, this is the schism that this whole bill kind of glides around and sort of completely overshoots. And in some sense, I think it is a landmine waiting to be activated by the fascists in our society. And they will use it as a weapon, and perhaps they will try to have it refined in the courts towards their liking and their sensibility on the matter. It's just sad that the legislation itself is not forthrightly engaged in these fundamental issues and problems. It doesn't even think to anticipate this, but also because it's probably completely on the other side. This is probably a legislation that could be used to imprison me, for instance. Quite. I, I'm not sure. I need to look at the legal precedent on this, but there is I think there was already a case. I don't know the details about it, but I saw it mentioned in someone's article. Uh, a constitutional case which seemed to kind of completely backtrack on earlier judgments that were made over freedom of speech, that literally had to do with the Promotion of Equality Act. And I was not even keenly aware of this judgment. Uh, and it was mentioned in passing, and I don't know the content of the judgment, but it was implied that essentially that the Promotion of Equality Act somehow was almost had the force of the Constitution in that it could not be criticized, which is a very strange position. That seems to be the connotation that somehow our jurisprudence in South Africa is so contorted and institutionally corrupted that it's something like the Promotion of Equality Act cannot be declared unconstitutional because it's the governmental prerogative to institute it. But you can't criticize the Promotion of Equality Act because it has the force of the Constitution, or it's secondary legislation, as it's called, which means that it's secondary in that it's second to the Constitution, and all other legislation is if you take this kind of pattern, is tertiary. So it's like it's above other legislation. It's kind of it's above because it's seen as giving force to the Constitution. And so, you know, that they almost are trying to have it both ways, is that they have literally made the government the arbiter over the Constitution, and they already get a kind of authoritarian, in a kind of authoritarian fashion, define the value of the law and the content of the law, beyond judicial invigilation. And it's also, there's so many things that have been completely screwed up in the South African legal framework, because the actual structure of the law, I would argue, is that something like affirmative action can actually not be done in the private sector. I would argue that only the government can impose structures of affirmative action, which is why, you know, that essentially the government should have pilot projects. It should have particular halfway houses. It should target disadvantage, and it should try to develop people and try to fix things. And the government is, I think, the only institution within society that has, I mean, it not only has a constitutional duty to do this, but I think that it is actually illegal for anything else to do it. So what government did instead was that they created a legislation to pass the buck onto the private sector, to say, no, the private sector has to make quotas that fall into these categories, that they have to take these rules and apply them to how they do business. They have to have this percentage of black ownership, and they have to have this percentage of employment equity, and all this kind of stuff. And as soon as they did that, as soon as they passed the buck, essentially, then they could always, you know, essentially they've been able to take responsibility for transformation, and they've been able to divert it and dilute it over the system. And then if they fail, they can say, well, the system is not living up to what we expect from them. The system is evil, the system is too white, the system is too privileged, or whatever. It just feeds into their fascist conspiracy theory, and they've found a way to pass the buck. They found a way to scapegoat their unaccountable leadership and irresponsibility. They found a way to basically turn it into political fuel for more overreaching powers and more restrictions and limitations and extractions, and a kind of moral hostage taking of the whole political arena, which has lost any of its kind of credibility and integrity because of this political consciousness circus. So when this is the issue, uh, because of how government has devolved its duty, its constitutional duty, for affirmative action, and placed the onus on the private sector, what they did as well is they kind of invoked and imposed a kind of a de facto racial consciousness, because that is how this law operates. That's how the Promotion of Equality Act operates. And so I think that in this case, I'm not entirely sure. So I mean, anyway, so I'm not even talking. Well, I wasn't even speculating about what the case actually, what the judgment was in the judgment, but just basically the point that I'm making is that this is already the opposite of how it should happen. Is that the government should it was unconstitutional for the government to place these kinds of restrictions on the private sector, because it's horribly merged the responsibility. I mean, it's not as if the government in making its pilot projects could have gone with private sector partners. They could have set up particular things with private sector partners, but they would be private public partnerships, and they would be, let's say, in the spirit of transformation, and it would be done under the auspices of a governmental entity, or a kind of or some kind of composite, maybe some kind of consortium or some kind of project or some kind of but essentially it would be, the buck would stop at the political master who devised it, who designed it. So it would be under the responsibility of government. It wouldn't be essentially it wouldn't be part of the scapegoating, which would also mean that then you wouldn't be constantly gaslighted by the racial consciousness narrative all the time, um, which I would even argue that the hate speech legislation is itself a kind of another iterative wave in that ramping up of that tumultuous engine of kind of resentful impetus towards some kind of more overt despotism and racial chauvinism and identitarian fervor and such, which we see, manifested in Julius Malema, but also in, the pronouncements of many people in high-ranking positions in the ANC. Even even Tito Mboweni. Um, I mean, there's a huge difference. Ever since Zuma was the president onwards, there's been a huge degeneration in the moral standing of the kind of rhetoric of ANC. Thabo Mbeki was the last good uh, uh, president of South Africa. Thabo Mbeki never made this kind of racial scapegoating, although um, some of the legislation that is problematic occurred under his watch. But it just shows you, I think, how when the rot sets in, uh, I really do track a lot of the moral degeneration to the institutionalized corruption of the legal system. But anyway, so I do think that there's probably a whole set of judgments which have entrenched this moral corruption and this judgment that I was talking about, which I'm speculating as to the content of it. But I think it puts the Promotion of Equality Act into some special category, which is really a category that it doesn't deserve to hold, but also a kind of that has become a kind of moral orthodoxy. It's become a kind of cultural dogma, which now the state is allowed to protect with a kind of against freedom, as a restriction against freedom of expression, which will perhaps become more institutionalized with the hate speech bill, which is again like a double contradiction. And because now that they've made it a governmental prerogative, that would mean that especially it needs to be under the scope of political debate and political criticism and political commentary. So to create something that is going to be under the auspices of a governmental prerogative, but then make the form that governmental prerogative has taken as sacrosanct as the Constitution, is is a manifest inconsistency, um, is an incongruence that is just, it is fundamentally unsound. It's and I would hazard a bet that we have that kind of contradiction within the jurisprudence. But anyway, if anyone is listening to this and they are more familiar with the actual, I mean, I must say, I really follow the themes in these things, and I really just care about the Constitution itself. I don't really care about how it's been bastardized, but in its unadulterated form, and it's in its unadulterated morality, which is obviously losing standing all the time. It's taken so many slings and arrows and I, I don't know if I mean I think there is quite an overt authoritarian drive that gearing up towards seriously altering and maiming and reducing the Constitution to facilitate a more authoritarian. Anyway, that's the kind of the stage of decomposition that South Africa is in. Um, the question really is that are the electorates independent enough of let's say the mainstream media, which is so trapped within the racial grift narrative and is also themselves quite co-opted by politicians and the ownership from the black elite. I mean, a lot of these meaning-making institutions have just been outright or just outright owned by uh, affiliates of the governing party, and people who have made serious money off state contracts and uh, let's say the legalized corruption of black empowerment. Yeah, so just to finish off the point about what kind of prohibitions we need, I think that crimen injuria essentially already covers um, when people are being incredibly uh, when their dignity is being infringed by somebody else. Criminal injuria already offers a criminal resolution, and for normal people, as it were. And hate speech is necessary to criminalize, but that it needs to really apply to people who are um, propagating hatred towards groups of people, which and perhaps even and the idea that a lot of this hatred can be covered by academic freedom just because there's a kind of there's a political ideological academic narrative that can be attached to something is obviously very dangerous, and sort of just shows how weak the principles of the Constitution have been watered down to, um, and I guess that's what happens when you also have legislation which has tried every which way to sort of create a nebulous uh, set of moral standards, because without that nebulous set of moral standards and moral corruption, you won't be able to facilitate practical state corruption, essentially. And so, sort of, morality has been sacrificed on the altar of state corruption. And that has had uh, a resounding knock on effect of creating a whole economy for toxic politics and identitarianism in general, essentially, all of which obscure the issue of responsibility and self ownership and instead replace it with a kind of identitarian racial consciousness or identitarian pride and sort of group essentialism in some sense. And I think that that is also itself, I don't think that you can necessarily outlaw that, because if people want to do that, I think that that should perhaps be covered by freedom of speech, but it certainly crosses the line when people try to impugn the character of other groups. But you could say that it's I mean, sadly, it's going to be somewhat of a necessary output of someone who thinks of the world in terms of those kinds of generalizations or stereotypes or group belonging. Because if you believe that is an essential category and that that holds some kind of moral weight, then it's going to make sense that you're going to apportion different moral statuses to different groups or different designations. And so you can see that, that these are all consequences of people not being non-racialists. So, if you really want to do something about it, you really need to promote education, non-racialism in education, and that kind of moral framework and moral thinking, which will also make people anti-fragile. It'll also make people not vulnerable to being psychologically and emotionally prone to take offense, because then they won't say, "Oh, you're saying these things about my group." They'll say, "Oh, you're just a racist." That's the biggest problem, is that a lot of the people that take offense are themselves racialists. That's why they take offense, is because they believe in racialism already. It's just that they would rather have they would rather say, "Oh, well, my group only looks bad because your group is so evil and has undermined my group," which is, which is not a moral improvement, I would say. Then it's just the other side of the same racist coin, essentially. Um, so, I mean, a lot of the people who take offense to these things, I feel like they are often moral equivalents to one another. And just because one person has used a derogatory word and the other person hasn't used a derogatory word doesn't mean that they aren't both on a kind of moral um, equal standing, that they're not both morally impoverished to the same extent. Just because you've got one person caught saying the derogatory word and the other person hasn't used the derogatory word, they both have the same evil mentality and they both have the same evil moral compunction. So, you have the distinctions that the hate speech bill is trying to sort of elevate, which, quite frankly, hold no real moral difference, and which also, in some sense, these things are probably much more, in a nuanced and a sophisticated and a proper way, are much more properly meted out and adjudicated over in the jurisprudence that already exists around the elements of criminologia and the defenses of to criminologia. So all of which is the actual principled delineation of those things. As again I say that hatred is not even what elaborated on in the hate speech bill. I mean, so it's a missed opportunity, but it's also indicative of the decadence of our times and the slow march of a creeping authoritarianism and a laxness in principled lawmaking and giving way to uh, a kind of lawlessness that is defined by a kind of populist sentimentality, um, which is of course essentially it is the future bread and butter of the ruling party. Um, Let me add this other addendum because it kind of thematically I was sketching this, but I didn't explicitly make this point. Is that the reason why I'm complaining that the bill does not elaborate on hate is because then it provides this fundamental lacuna where there's no distinction made between hating someone's worldview, hating someone's belief structure, which might be very problematic, which might be very sort of hypocritical, and that someone's worldview might themselves be making themselves quite unsettled and emotionally and psychologically vulnerable, and might also themselves be quite pernicious or be quite projective in how they scapegoat problems onto other people. So there's no qualitative test on terms of, well, some ideologies, some beliefs are worth hating, and in some sense this is where black fascism creates the tip of its spear, because it takes issue with everyone and everything that doesn't already concede that it holds the moral high ground and that it should be able to corrupt the state and use law and use the legal framework itself to um, impose its sort of self righteousness and its kind of moral bias and chauvinism and racial consciousness and all those kinds of toxic things. And so it's going to consider itself the victim and emotionally repressed or suppressed if you don't see to it the moral high ground. And if you criticize it, it's going to say, well, I'm emotionally the victim. I've been emotionally harmed by this person who they will label as a white supremacist. So the clash of ideas and the hate for people's belief systems is not the same thing as hating immutable characteristics. So there's no stark distinction that is made between hating an immutable characteristic and hating a worldview that might itself be fundamentally entrenched into racial identitarianism. And so, and essentially, because the whole functioning of this hate speech bill is centered around the subjective perspective of the victim of the crime, and how emotional or psychological harm that they have felt, and all they have to do is say, look, literally the other person has used these words, has used, and they can just decontextualize things, they can just take things out of context and say, you see, they've made arguments, they've made claims that relate to these protected categories and these protected group characteristics, which are immutable characteristics. Never mind that they stoked the argument, that they provoked the argument, that they were using generalizations and then they just had their generalizations, their racialist generalizations contradicted or disentangled or rebutted. That they will say, oh, because you've rebutted generalizations about groups, you are casting aspersions against groups. So that kind of murkiness, that kind of obtuse provocation, and in some sense setting up these kinds of manipulative and misleading characterizations and decontextualization, that the bill is going to be completely insensitive to. It'll just basically say, well, you seem like you're put together and that you haven't had emotional and psychological harm, and so when you were battling in the field of ideas and you were contradicting these other people's worldview, they complain that they have been psychologically and emotionally harmed, and you seem put together. So they are the victim, and what you were arguing about is related to these protected categories, and so never mind that the whole gauntlet, that the whole conflagration was essentially staged and set up by the people who are then complaining about being emotionally and psychologically harmed. Never mind that these are the people who actually have the toxic racial consciousness, because essentially the bill should not be the prevention of hate crime and hate speech. It should be the promotion and education of non-racialism. But, again, the political arena has already betrayed and murdered the constitutional value of non-racialism. They have already consciously, they have constructed policy, they have constructed things like the Promotion of Equality Act, which fundamentally imposes an orthodoxy of racial consciousness and toxic racial grifting and racial narratives and stereotyping, because they have said that tokenism is part of how the law operates, that we can use race as a proxy for disadvantage. And as soon as you allow that kind of generalization, then you've already created a toxic racial consciousness environment. And so now all they have to do is say that they're protecting the status quo, essentially, which is somehow constitutional, although it's never been constitutionally tested, because the Constitutional Court will say it's just a governmental prerogative. So it basically becomes a partisan political issue, but now they also want to protect it because it's secondary legislation. So they say it has the force and the majesty of the Constitution. It has the sanctity of the Constitution. So they've really created a paradox. They've really created a moral corruption, an institutionalized corruption of the morality of non-racialism. And now they've got the ammunition to protect this entrenched toxic position. And so we have essentially an untenable fascistic spiraling vortex. We've got an engine that will continue to radicalize politics, that will continue to inflame and incentivize toxic racial grifting and race baiting. And because the hate speech bill fundamentally frames itself in terms of the harm that the victim receives, whoever complains the loudest and seemingly has, let's say, conforms to popular sentiment, so as long as there's a general feeling that this is the new definition of non-racialism, that anti-racism and identity politics is how you get equality, is the formula that it's worthy to treat people as tokens of their group, because that is exactly how the Promotion of Equality Act operates, using race as a proxy for disadvantage. Because we've got all of that conflated now into this disgusting fascistic politics of a kind of social psychology, that it's about rehabilitating your racial identity, not promoting and educating people about non-racialism and non-racialist ethics and basic principles. That's all swept aside by how harmed do you feel, how psychologically brittle and vulnerable do you feel, stoking that defense of the racial identity, essentially setting it up to create a race war, essentially, an ideological race war, which the hate speech bill has absolutely no sensitivity to, and in some sense exacerbates, and it creates the ammunition to accelerate that kind of ideological hatred, hate mongering, and people identity mongering. So this is going to be a huge ammunition. This is going to be a huge boon to essentially the racial politicians, the racial politics, and it's going to be, in some senses, probably going to be used as, I can just imagine that these racial, essentially fascistic left wing fascistic race and identity professors, race and gender lecturers, that if someone now speaks out against their teaching, against their disgusting academic models of morality which undermine the constitutional values, they will then say, well, no, you can't actually argue against this, because if you argue against this, you're entrenching white supremacy, that you are a racist, and that you are, in fact, now also perpetrating hate speech. Because, silence is violence. It lends itself into the semantic confusion where people can just rationalize, well, you are actually being you are inciting harm because your views themselves are normalizing white supremacy and all that other, where white supremacy means anything that you want it to mean. It just means essentially that when you're not voting for radical racial ways of redistributing, and essentially that you have to damage. It's a very kind of parasitic sort of thing, that you have to treat people as tokens of their identity, and you have to rehabilitate their identity, not actually fix disadvantages. It's a complete sort of diversion way of doing politics, because that is how you get corrupt, politically connected people able to steal money and essentially to be corrupt, because the moral corruption gives them the cover to do so. Because you can say, no, it doesn't matter, we just need a certain amount of black ownership, we just need a certain rating, we need to meet our quotas of black equity, and so it doesn't matter that whether these people were rich or middle class or whatever. It just matters what the number is between black and white. That's the only thing that they care about, is balancing some equilibrium between black and white. It has nothing to do with targeting disadvantage. It has nothing to do with transformation and development. It just has to do with some irrelevant statistic, so that government can dilute responsibility onto the entire system and say, well, if things aren't looking good, it's because the system itself doesn't want to transform. Never mind that their quota system is fundamentally inorganic, is fundamentally artificial, and it's artificial in exactly the right way in order to facilitate corruption and facilitate elite capture and patronage and all the other things that we suffer from in this country, because the law itself is institutionally corrupt. It's morally corrupted, and it's that moral corruption that facilitates the state corruption, essentially. And now this hate speech bill is going to essentially be a way of securing this orthodoxy, securing this assault on the consciousness of the new South Africa, and the fundamental pillars that the democracy of the new South Africa was built on, non-racialism, which it's ironic that something about the prevention of hate speech and hate crime is exactly what it professes in its title. It is, I would say, the tip of a spear for ongoing hate crime and an ongoing gaslighting, because you will not be able to express yourself. You will not be able to politically take people to task and argue with ideas, because you're going to be constantly harangued now and threatened that you are breaching you're crossing the line into hate speech. Watch out! You're going to be crossing the line. That's going to be the threat that is going to be mounted by these people, because hate is not elaborated on in the bill. So all the clarification, all the elaboration that the Constitution could really have benefited from in a kind of anti-hate speech legislation and prevention of hate speech legislation is all essentially lost because of the need to create ammunition for their racial narrative grifting and their race baiting and their continued, let's say, boiling the democracy into a more fascistic and racial political scenario. Because again, the kind of hate speech that should be targeted is the one that dresses itself up as ideology, that dresses itself up as a kind of a political worldview, and that uses general accusations and indictments that are essentially targeting immutable characteristics. And there's no qualitative measure. There's no, um, I mean, the whole thing that it'll eventually rest on essentially is, well, is this comment, is this statement, is the claim being made in the public interest? And that will really matter if you're a non-racialist or if you are a, a black identitarian or a white identitarian or any kind of identitarian. But, essentially, policy and the Promotion of Equality Act has essentially already said that black identitarianism is a useful, it can be used as a proxy. The black identity is a valid proxy for disadvantage. That is what we have in the morally corrupted law, in the unconstitutional law, which the Constitutional Court will not throw out because they will say we can't even test it. We won't test it because there's a governmental prerogative and they can politically choose to do whatever they want, essentially. So they have given up the value of non-racialism. They have ceded it to the majority. They've ceded it to the groupthink, to the mob. And then obviously we have a distorted political lens. We have a distortion of responsibility, because that's also what the Promotion of Equality Act does, is it passes the buck to the private sector, and then whenever we fail to transform, they just say, well, it's the private sector isn't helping us, the private sector is undermining us. And they have, all these strange economic people who love creating, sort of, all of these academic people, you find themselves, you find them colluding with each other in lots of sort of strange ways, because they love creating sort of weird consensus positions that are built out of all these specialities that kind of, don't take a holistic approach, don't look at things, on the level of human agency and intelligence. They like sort of deconstructing the problem up into their little specialized domains, and then they can each piece it together to make a strange kind of chimeric hydra consensus position, which then is impossible to assail. It's impossible to contradict, because as soon as you try to pull on one thread, then one of the other heads will come and bite you. It's kind of like a and this has always been the strategy of, oligarchy. This has always been the strategy of authoritarianism, is that, you make the issue opaque. You strangely, you conflate it and you generalize it, and you turn it into a kind of murky abstraction, so that then you can just kind of get away with doing this heuristic and that heuristic to kind of, but it's never argued from first principles. It's never really reasoned and shown to be sound. It's just a kind of, it's a Tower of Babel at the end of the day. And that's what we have in the hate speech bill, is that we have a another patchwork, another piece of the decadence of a corrupt state that is increasingly driving itself towards authoritarian powers and authoritarian um, levers and mechanisms. And this, obviously, this bill was designed not to carry forward the principle of non-racialism. It was designed to empower the groupthink, the mob, and it is going to be used by the racialists. It's very clearly is going to be used. Um, it is in some sense designed to be abused. It's designed to facilitate this kind of toxic racialism. And I do think that we will see examples, if this bill is passed. This is how it's going to happen. I mean, it's all going to come to what is in the public interest and what isn't in the public interest. And because essentially policy already exists that isn't constitutionally tested, the Promotion of Equality Act already is part of the law. That is going to be the standard that is going to help to define what the public interest is defined as. And so, strangely, it's going to become sanctified. It's going to become a kind of, it's going to become official orthodoxy. It's going to be imposed as a dogma on culture and political commentary. It's going to be normalized. This fascistic morality is going to be normalized. Now, I mean, look, there might be some arguments that, well, if it is a governmental prerogative, then it is within the political sphere. But now, again, this has to do with the case that I don't actually know what the judgment in the case was, but I think that there is already a corruption in the law around the Promotion of Equality Act and freedom of expression, because I've read it in an article that the position on freedom of expression was shifted and it was connected with this case. So I'll still have to see how that... the person who wrote the article promised, it was Anthea from the Institute of Race Relations was writing. I think her name is Anthea Jeffries. I must apologize. I'm sometimes very bad at remembering people's names, but I believe it was an article that I read by Anthea who mentioned this case, and she said that she would elaborate it in a future article. So I guess I will comment on this in the future, but I do think that already freedom of expression in principle has already been watered down since the Promotion of Equality Act, and since so I mean I'm kind of sketching out how I think that this all hangs together in a very toxic way, in a very institutionally corrupt way, and you can see how the one hand is washing the other hand in terms of protecting this institutionalized corruption and advancing it forward into a more authoritarian political binding. But also that I've tried to I didn't okay, let me make the other more general case, is that we already have criminuria. It really doesn't make sense to try to police. Look, I mean, I would prefer if everyone was a non-racialist, but there are some moral standards that cannot be imposed on culture, that cannot be imposed on individual people. There's also another right in the Constitution, it's the right to freedom of conscience. And you can't force people through thought control or through thought crime to take on different beliefs. So we do have to tolerate people's unpleasant and morally evil points of view. And I think that repressing people's freedom of expression also means that we don't get to hear the clash of ideas, because sometimes people, they just need arguments, and we also need to be able to field arguments. But when you create a list of banned words, when you create a list of thought crime, it also means that you can't find solutions to people's problems. You just sweep them under the rug. You just say, no, you have to keep them private, or you have to be very careful about how you air your views. this is not useful for cultural evolution, for people to change their minds. And I do think it is possible that people can see the other side. They can hear the argument against their point of view. And this is going to have a chilling effect on all of that. Now, that's for private individuals. Obviously, it's different when you are actually if you are a semi-celebrity, if you are a political person or a political leader, or you're actually a kind of prominent person and you are creating vague accusations, nebulous moral claims, you're making blanket um, indictments against groups of people, that's dangerous on another layer. You know, the normalizing hatred that is kind of in the vogue of normalizing essentially public violence, that is on the way to normalizing public violence, or is that on the way to also scapegoating people? Like making accusations, blanket accusations and indictments and blame, essentially, that if you make accusations, you have to prove them. And if they're impossible to prove because they are so fundamentally morally hollow, because they're just, I mean, it's just basically like a radical racial conspiracy theory, like the Jewish conspiracy or something like that. If you just the kind of conspiracy theory that you see out of Julius Malema all the time. This is stuff that is obviously dangerous. It's dangerous for the Constitution, fundamentally. I mean, this is constitutional damages. I think hate speech needs to be measured against the concept of constitutional damage. Now, let's say you are a white racist and you are saying derogatory words to somebody else who happens to be a black person, and there's an altercation, and then there's racial derogatory words which are used. Now, in such an example, has there been constitutional damage? Yes, you could say that there's been personal, emotional abuse, emotional psychological harm, perhaps. Again, I do think that a lot of the emotional psychological harm is only relevant to the extent to which people don't actually believe in non-racialism. I think that you become essentially invulnerable to I mean, if you want to see an example of this, if you watch the Bill Cosby show from the 90s, and we watch, there was a perfect episode where the wife, I can't remember the name of a character because the Cosby show was the family in the Cosby show was not, their surname was not Cosby, but it's and their name started with an H, I think. But she was confronted with white racists who were treating her in a very diminutive way. They didn't use derogatory terms, but they certainly insulted her dignity. And you can see how she took that. She took it stoically. And the reason why she took it stoically is because it didn't change her views about herself. She was confident in that her immutable characteristic of her race was not being impugned by these people who she would not take offense from, even though offense was being offered to her identity. Okay? So I'm just trying to say that essentially a lot of people who hold their identities out as being vulnerable are doing so because because they have racialist views themselves. And you can say that is a failure of the state to educate and promote the value and the belief of non-racialism, because also the ANC uses racial politics as the only thing holding it together, because it doesn't deserve to be a governing party. I mean, it's a disgrace. It's pathetic. Its performance. It takes no responsibility for its own failures. Essentially, it just scapegoats it onto the minority white people. It says, oh, they're the reason why we haven't made good progress. It's utterly disgusting. So that's the only thing holding their party together. So you can see why they haven't promoted non-racialism, is because they would be nailing their own coffin. closed and shut. So that's a fundamental contradiction that we're living with in contemporary South politics in South Africa, and again, this is something that obviously is something that the hate speech bill has to play into, because it doesn't have the temerity, it doesn't have the virtue, it doesn't have the transparency to actually do what it should be doing. And so, it fundamentally is another example of the institutionalized corruption of the South African state, essentially. Um, okay, but the example is that you have a white person saying derogatory things to a black person. Okay, now, is this hate speech? Now, again, I do think that it would make a lot more sense to ground hate speech in constitutional damages. So, is the Constitution damaged by there being a white racist that said derogatory things to a black person? I mean, maybe a little bit, maybe, but not. It doesn't really impugn the Constitution. I mean, maybe in the current climate, it kind of reinforces a polemic that's being made by the racialists in some sense. So it's I mean, getting back to the baseline of non-racialism is kind of unhelpful, because it can be trotted out as an example for the racial narrative, essentially. But we can't even, that's the level in which this racial conflagration is being framed. That's the level that equality is being framed in. Is that whereas how many recipients? I mean, if you reversed that example, would you even consider thinking that that would be hate speech? If you said that, let's say that there was a black businessman who owns a business and runs a business, and there was a white employee, and the white employee got fired and got pelted with racial derogatory slurs and accusations against their group. I mean, would people even consider that amounted to constitutional damages? I mean, yes, it might be crimen injuria. I'm not saying it's not a crime. I'm not saying that certain kinds of insults, when they actually strike at the dignity of an individual, is crimen injuria. But to extend hate speech to say that, well, they are these special naughty words, they are these special derogatory words, because they are attacking a whole group of immutable characteristics. Well, you see, I have a different argument against those types of derogatory words. The reason why those derogatory words are bad is not because specifically they are putting pressure on a specific group. It's that the idea that you can actually stereotype a group, the idea that you can paint a group with one brush, the idea that a group has an essential characteristic, and that people aren't made up of their own freedom of conscience and decision making, and can choose choose their own character, essentially. That they're not responsible for their own qualitative constituents of their own being. That essentially immutable characteristics are essentially irrelevant in moral quality or moral characteristics. So, in some sense, the only thing that I have against derogatory terms and slurs against groups is that they're inaccurate. They are just invalid. They're just they're void in that they are just they are wrong in a general sense. They're not wrong in a specific sense, as if that specific thing doesn't apply to that group. I'm sure it would apply to some members of that group, because every group has got every sin under the sun within its ambit. You can't say, it's not the difference between, okay, well, all of these people are like this, and no, it's not true, it's the opposite. No, it's not the opposite, it's both. It is true and it's not true. So it's just invalid, so that's the problem, is that it's invalid. But this is playing into the idea of trying to promote a positive stereotype and saying that no, we need the positive pushback and we need to silence the critique. It's a fundamentally kind of, it's stoking a conflagration, really. And in some sense, it may be the language of the hate speech bill hides this stoking of the conflagration, because it basically hides behind the definition of harm, and it says, well, if people feel harmed, psychologically and emotionally harmed, then we will stand behind protecting the victim who is harmed, because harm includes emotional and psychological harm. We're not going to say that if you are emotionally and psychologically harming yourself because you actually need to have a positive image of your immutable characteristic. No, people should not have a positive image of their immutable characteristics. They should have a neutral image of their immutable characteristics. It should not be positive. Black is not good, white is not good, black is not bad, white is not bad. It should be neutral, non-racialist. That's what it means. But no, instead, this legislation is all about endorsing people's feeling of harm, their subjective relativistic feeling of harm. So what does it do to the ideology of non-racialism? It just basically says it's a free-for-all as long as you can complain that you've been emotionally harmed. So the black racialists that will complain that they've been emotionally harmed, they're going to get a blank check. They can cash it. They can go double down and play at the casino, and they can just keep on going back with their blank check until they win big, until they win the whole society, until they win the whole culture, until they threaten everyone because of their vulnerable narcissism and because their psychological structure tells them that they are harmed when they don't win the moral high ground. And this is to have this institutionalized into the law is obviously dangerous. It's a poison pill. It's also a way of continually furthering the attrition and corrosion of non-racialism. It somewhat cements the erosion of these basic values, because essentially there is no expression of them in the law anymore. They've been replaced by these fudged concepts of harm. So yeah, we have, unless the jurisprudence about hate speech adopts all the things that I'm saying and develops a sensitivity and a sophistication to all the things that I'm bringing up, which is nowhere mentioned. It's nowhere mentioned in the legislation. You could maybe fix the legislation by essentially saying, well, the incitement of hatred has to include all of these sophisticated things that I'm bringing up here. That essentially what the substantive content of what inciting hatred means all this understanding about what non-racialism actually is and what the actual base moral thing is. That needs to be the baseline standard that is applied to contextualize what people are talking about. But again, hate speech should really be centered around constitutional damage. It should not be centered around essentially helping crimen injuria cases become more sorry, I can't think of the word, more the penalty to essentially increase the criminal sanction, to increase the punishment, or to sort of to create a shame, a kind of a public shame that you're going to be public shamed for, because I mean a lot of the time derogatory slurs as well are not even used. They're used because of emotional reasons in some sense. They're used. I mean, I use slurs which I don't consider to be racialist at all. Perhaps it is actually worthy for me to talk about this. But which other people, I mean, I didn't even realize that people considered this a racial slur. Um, but I use the phrase piece of shit to mean someone who is morally repugnant. That's what that slur means to me. Someone who is morally deficit. Someone who is I mean, I can tell you in my history. Usually, I when I'm referring to someone, I'm usually referring to a white person. But I mean, it's not to me. It doesn't. I don't use this phrase. It's not correlated to the race of the target of the person, and it has no racial, in my understanding, it has no racial component to it. But to other people, it is interpreted that way. So, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, because that's still what I think. When someone does something that I find morally repugnant and that is morally corrupt, in my mind, that's what I say about them. That's how I label them in my mind. I because I consider them to be filth. That's I mean that's basically a synonym for me for a kind of moral filth. So that is what I mean. So it's interesting that but also people that this is a complicated topic, and I don't know if I want to make such a long recording, but language and culture, but also people's own internal worldview, is going to be populated by stereotypes and generalizations. We have to have low resolution images of the world to navigate the world. Obviously, we should not hold generalizations and stereotypes against individuals when we come across individuals. Because if we do that, we're being a moral reprobate. I mean, it's not morally correct to assume that a generalization is going to apply to any individual of a group. But let me just make an example as to why generalizations are necessitated. Is because generalizations help you plan things when you are impersonally tracking a model of something. You have to, I mean, why wouldn't you? Sorry, I'm just trying to think of some examples. You know, you answer the question to yourself, like, would you go to this neighborhood? Would you go to this part of town at this time of night? Would you feel safe to do that? Or that kind of decision making, you make that decision based on generalizations. So when you're making impersonal plans in your mind, you are going to use generalizations to help you plan things pragmatically. So, whether you should consider a course of action feasible or unfeasible, you're going to generally use generalizations as part of that equation. That doesn't mean that your equation is going to be correct. Maybe you could go to that part of town at that point at night and nothing bad would happen to you. That doesn't mean that it's generally going to be a prudent thing to do, or it's going to be generally a safe thing to do. Okay, so we need generalizations to have a low resolution image of things so that we can actually plan things intelligently, so that we can make intelligent discriminations about deliberating our courses of action. Deliberation requires discrimination. Now, obviously, when you're confronted with an individual, you should not unfairly discriminate against an individual based on low resolution generalizations. You should hold your generalizations away from how you treat an individual. You should take an individual and you should, obviously, time permitting. I mean, obviously, when a stranger crosses you in the street, you don't say, okay, well, they're not. Strangers crossing you in the street are not individuals. Individuals are people that you are having communication with, that you're, that you are addressing. that you're in some kind of context um, that makes them an individual. Um, so like the I mean, this is part of the problem of living in large cities is that, I mean, you can't treat every person who crosses your path as an individual. I mean, they're a crowd of people. That's what they are. People are crowds, and you're walking through crowds. And otherwise, if you didn't take on that low resolution way of interfacing with the world, I mean, you would go a bit insane, because we can't cope with all these different faces. You can't humanize. They've said often that human beings are designed to like live in communities of 150 to 200 people. You can't really humanize that. You can't constantly humanize crowds in the street and strangers. You can't do that. But obviously, in a context in which you are engaging with someone, then you have to start treating them like an individual. People have to make these almost procedural moral distinctions. Um, anyway, so what is my point here? So I'm just talking about the necessity of making generalizations. So why was I talking about that? Yeah. So I mean, non-racialism and generalizations are things that need to go together in the human toolkit of actually having a, a sustainable um, psychology and mentality in some sense. And the idea that your generalizations need to be politically controlled or need to sort of be controlled by some new morality that is some kind of groupthink or that mediates power and tries to derive an equilibrium between groups of people based on their immutable characteristics well, that would be a failure of non-racialism already. So I mean, first of all, it's going to be somewhat impossible to ever have a group of people that will ever be equal to another group of people. Like the median person, the average. I mean, the average might be pretty close or something like that. But I mean, every group is going to be, is going to have a different statistic, and it's probably going to have a slight. I mean, depends, I guess, how detailed and precise the measurement of your statistics are. But like trying to aim towards an equality of outcome, is itself a racialist project in some sense. Um, Equality, as it's described in the Constitution, is already guaranteed. It's already achieved in theory, as it were. It needs to be enhanced, and it will be enhanced through tackling disadvantage and through targeting disadvantage and making proper inroads on those sorts of things. But the idea that you can just try to manhandle the statistics and you can just try to fudge and control outcomes and in order uh, I mean, that already is a morally corrupt project, which is obviously designed and facilitates state corruption, which is why we suffer from these things, is because government has tried to shirk its duty and its responsibility to tackle disadvantaged. It's diluted it, it's spread it across, it's dispersed it across the private sector so that it can scapegoat the private sector, essentially, while it continues to essentially facilitate a kind of racialist hostage taking and a racialist parasitic, extraction of, it's a kind of tax on the economy, because you have to pay some black businessman to be a middleman somewhere, and then that middleman will not even create a local company. They will just be a shell corporation that will subcontract the work either to an overseas importation, or it won't even generate local labor. And the black businessman will just be a kind of will add no value, is just there to provide the quota of black equity. So it taxes the whole system. It just makes business in South Africa more expensive, which eventually is paid for by the consumer. So everything becomes more expensive, and so the quality of life goes down essentially, and we become poorer because essentially money is going to people that are adding no value, and so we basically have an inflationary pressure, and inflation taxes everyone, and it hurts the poor the most. And so we have fundamentally a broken and artificial economy. But anyway, these are how these things are kind of. It's very hard to track these things, how they all sort of relate to one another. Okay, just to neatly try to tie up some of these soft issues, or some of these tangents that I was bringing up, because I was just trying to bring into focus the fact that even someone who is a non-racialist is going to, in their own mind, have generalizations, and is going to have low resolution models of the world, is going to have stereotypes. What makes a non-racialist, let's say, morally uh, 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 proficient and ethically clean and transparent is that one does not use one's stereotypes against individuals. That is the important qualification. It's not that you don't have stereotypes. It's impossible to go through the world and not create stereotypes. It's how you use them. It's how as I say, impersonal planning is going to, like into, well, I mean, not across the board. I mean, it depends, I guess, how, it's an ingredient. Stereotypes are an ingredient in terms of one's mental thinking patterns and decision making, and you have to be very morally conscious how you are utilizing stereotypes and generalizations. And essentially, you have to know that they're essentially dangerous things, that they are morally dubious entities. You don't use stereotypes and generalizations. You don't let that touch how you comport yourself with individuals. Now, if people use derogatory words because they mean to be insulting to someone, it's not as if no one never deserves to be insulted. So, just because someone is using a word on a naughty list, is using a derogatory term, well, what is the actual context of what the actual contention is? What is the altercation based on? And so people, I can imagine that people who are non-racialists themselves can use derogatory words. Uh, you have to contextualize these things to know. So, I mean, really, in terms of the Constitution, I think the thing that hate speech, if hate speech is going to be criminalized, what hate speech should really be guarding against is the principle of non-racialism, and safeguarding that cornerstone of morality and ethics, and promoting and educating non-racialism and non-sexualism, which is not to say that you can't make yourself blind to the fact that on average women are shorter than men. So your stereotypical woman, your archetypal woman in your head, is going to be shorter than the archetypal man, perhaps. It's neither here nor there. Obviously that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be women that are taller than men. This is the it. So the idea that we have to disabuse ourselves and become anti-racist or anti-sexualists, or whatever, by removing the stereotype that women are shorter than men is just utter. It just is beyond. It really is to create a false moral domain and a false moral gauntlet in which we can have the worst kind of crazy argument in which the resolution of that abstract argument, oh, don't have a stereotype in which women are are shorter than men. So, okay, so now you've removed people's generalizations, you've removed people's stereotypes, and where does that get them? That just gets them. I mean, you can't live in the world, you can't make plans without generalizations and stereotypes. There's a certain, you need to have a low resolution understanding of things, but you just have to know that it's low resolution models of things are not morally actionable. You can't, if you're going to do something in which integrity matters, in which dignity matters, you have to remove that nebulous thinking. You have to remove, you can't use stereotypes when you're dealing with an individual. So if there is a woman who does have the lung capacity of the average man and who can go through the fireman obstacle course, and then they can test her blood oxygen levels, and they say that, yeah, why can't she be a firefighter? Of course she could be a firefighter, but that doesn't mean that we have to say that 50% of women and 50% of men should be firefighters. That it just, you can't track the outcome. You have to have objective standards. And if people can meet those objective standards, and those standards will be non-racialist and non-sexualist. So obviously the standards won't be that you have to be a man. The standards will be, well, can you actually do the obstacle course in the correct amount of time, and what is your lung capacity so that you don't die of smoke inhalation, which the average woman is going to obviously be at a disadvantage to the average man, essentially. So, but obviously saying that about, that's a generalization what I just said, the average woman compared to the average man. Well, when you actually have an applicant to become a firefighter, they aren't the average woman. There's no such thing as an average woman and an average man. It's an abstract, it's an abstraction. It exists in an impersonal way of looking at the world that is not actionable. It's not morally or ethically actionable. You can make some vague abstract conclusions from it. You can say that, well, yeah, would make sense that there are going to be fewer women firefighters than men. That's obviously going to make sense, and it's going to be essentially reasonable. If unless it just so happens that culture changes, or that, because it's not just capability that lands people into their posts and their positions and their jobs like firefighting. It's also the inclination. It's also that maybe fewer women than men want to become firefighters, and maybe that's because women gravitate towards other interests that, on average, statistically, that doesn't mean that there are no women that don't want to be firefighters. So again, there are going to be multivariant, there are going to be many different metrics, many different aspects that make up these sorts of things. But anyway, this is why people make stereotypes and generalizations in their own mind, is because they are keeping track of these things. Because, you could almost say that in the human being, in the human condition, in our intellectual life of thinking about things, we are going to look for patterns, we're going to see patterns. But certain patterns, like statistical patterns and generalizations, are morally dangerous. They're morally dubious, and we just have to put a big caveat under that data collection and data compression into a low resolution model. We have to be very careful that we don't use these things against individuals, because that would be essentially morally deficits. That would be that would fall short of a proper ethical framework, I would say. But again, you can't force people to have a proper ethical framework. You can encourage them, you can promote and educate proper morality, but you can't enforce morality. And again, this is why I think that, when you try to make virtue tests and you say, no, you've used a naughty word or something like that, well, how much damage have they really done against non-racialism? And I would argue that there's very little damage that you can do to non-racialism when the government itself has already used its its ideological might, and it's corrupted, it's institutionally corrupted the law to make non-racialism essentially, they've murdered it. They have betrayed it so thoroughly, and they've replaced it with a toxic racial consciousness, because there's tokenism built into the law. There is already a generalization built into the law. And it's morally unforgivable. I mean, I would argue that they have, I mean, I would think that this is on the level of almost like an international war crime or something like that. I mean, this is a crime against, this is a form of a crime against humanity. The damage that the government has done, and that the institutionalized corruption of the law has done to non-racialism, in instituting its disgusting form of tokenism and racial consciousness, that is how because it uses race as a proxy for disadvantage. Because it does that, it has undermined the value of non-racialism, and it has performed a constitutional damage. And that constitutional damage already is essentially, I mean, that's a crime against humanity. In the same way that apartheid was a disgusting moral blight, the ANC has perpetrated the same kind of moral evil, and we are seeing a second generation and a third generation of this toxicity permeating, and second order and third order of intellectual dishonesty, and covering it up and trying to rationalize it, and trying to create a hate speech bill that is compatible with this kind of fundamental hypocrisy, where they say both things. They say whatever they want. They say that they're non-racialists, and then they have this disgusting racialist institutionalized corruption of the law. So, they have it both ways, and then they can just kind of gaslight whoever complains about it, and then they can say, no, you are the one perpetrating hate speech, because you are actually standing up for the real morality of non-racialism and non-sexualism, and then they can castigate you, and then they can, just decontextualize morality and decontextualize reality, and just scapegoat you and blame it all on you, that if you weren't the one complaining about the system, then the system would already have worked, or something like that, as if it isn't fundamentally, endemically corrupt, that the moral corruption is the state corruption. It all comes from the moral corruption and the institutionalized corruption of the law. So anyway, that's my general thesis. So trying to come down hard on people for making derogatory terms, words themselves don't matter. It's the ideology. Is the ideology representative of a kind of hatred that is targeting an immutable characteristic? Is a moral accusation being attached to an immutable characteristic, like just being born a certain race or a certain ethnicity, which is exactly what the black fascists have done in this racial narrative and this racial consciousness that they promulgate. And so, the hate speech bill completely sidesteps all of these issues, and it really opens the door to a continued repromulgation of this institutionalized corruption, where one hand will wash the other hand, and they will protect their authoritarian political thought control, and then they can just use this superficial morality. They're saying, you used one of the words on the naughty list. Never mind that you were countermanding or contradicting the racial narrative of the other person. Because this is also part of the racial narrative and the race baiting, is that they exactly drive this toxic false equivalency. They try to get people to make the opposite generalization. They try to bait people into playing this tug of war, where they can say, you are denying equal pride to black consciousness, or equal, that it's all about repairing racial pride, when non-racialism has got nothing to do with racial pride. Non-racialism says that all racial pride is essentially a kind of fake illusion, and it's an ideological captivity. It's a prison of the mind, and it's there to facilitate unaccountable leadership, and it's there to facilitate stupidity and scapegoating, because it allows you to blind yourself to reality and to create a false way of pretending that you're going to make progress. because then you can say, no, no, the project is social psychology. The project is repairing the black identity and trying to give more dignity to the black identity by creating tokens and giving rich, politically connected black elites even more power and influence, because somehow their prestige is going to be reflect on the whole, on the identity as a whole, and so it obviously creates corruption like that, because I mean, it is what it is itself in a self-denigrating position. It has already given up its own fundamental dignity because it repudiates its own individualism, and it creates a toxic collective consciousness, which you can use then, that propaganda, you can use that umbrella, that banner, that it's almost like that the call to that race war can be used as a diversion to and it's very hard to break this, because if you try to debunk it, then people will say that you're perpetrating hate speech when you're trying to derail this fascistic, disgusting racialist consciousness. They will turn on you, and because it's very hard to tell people that you have been fooled by this moral corruption, that you have been taken in by, I mean, it's almost a demonic kind of because, I mean, it really is, Nietzsche would have called it a slave morality. I mean, this is the definition of slave morality, where you are doing work for your identity, and the identity is the solution to everything. And so someone just has to say that they're doing it for the collective identity, and then everyone gets behind them, and no one, the devil is in the detail, and no one looks at the detail. It's all about, well, if there's something bad happening, it's because we haven't come down hard enough, we haven't been radical enough, we haven't been strict enough on our ideological opposition. So you always just divert the blame onto the outgroup. It just continually takes no responsibility for its own mismanagement and its own corruption. It just continually, it's a self-fueling dishonesty machine. And the people who take the counsel from the wicked, obviously will not be blessed, will come to no good end. And they come to no good end, and they take that grievance and they double down with it, and they recycle it into even more rabid, fascistic, disgusting, toxic consciousness. And it just gets more and more self-deluded. The hyper-realism of fascism, that is what we live in, and the media has no integrity, the journalists have no integrity, because there are enough academics with no integrity that have created this bandwagon, and with this collective groupthink, they just... the one hand washes the other, and that's the kind of corruption that we live in. But on some level, we need to blame the courts more than anyone else, because they are the ones that are meant. They have the duty to protect the Constitution, and they have shirked their duty. They have helped the ANC government murder non-racialism. They have helped them dissolve and disintegrate, and there is essentially nothing left. And when this hate speech bill, combined with the legislation that is already on the books, the Promotion of Equality Act, what you get is an authoritarian orthodoxy, and you get a political mechanism of thought control, and essentially liberty, and and freedom of consciousness, and we already had criminuria. We already have criminuria. What we needed hate speech. We need law against hate speech, but we need it against constitutional damages and people that are performing damage to non-racialism. But they have already betrayed non-racialism. They have already murdered and buried it. The question is can it be resurrected? That is the real question in contemporary South African politics. Can the Constitution be resurrected? Can these judges be impeached? Can we bring back the constitutional order, because it is not in effect, and in my view it is a crime against humanity, but also these people who try to campaign to have the Constitution reduced, to have the Bill of Rights removed, or parts of the Bill of Rights removed. This is also, in my view, completely unconstitutional, but I hold an original South African constitutionalist position, because how can you campaign to reduce the Bill of... You can only campaign to increase the rights or to elaborate, to make more clear something, but you can amend the Constitution by adding to it, but you cannot reduce it. If you reduce something in the Bill of Rights, you have already campaigned to undermine the supreme law of the land. If it is the supreme law of the land, how can it be justifiable or conceivable that you can try to promote reducing it? That is already a kind of crime that amounts to a constitutional damage that I would argue even is a kind of hate speech. So, really, hate speech needs to be centered around the principle or around the concept of constitutional damages. That's what we needed hate speech for. And this bill did absolutely nothing to elaborate that. And instead, they just tried to cover their own political arses because they already have destroyed non-racialism, and they are trying essentially to find more nails to bang into the coffin to keep it to keep the Constitution institutionally corrupted and essentially dead. I mean, it might have some lingering phantasm and some lingering form that, well, it's still taking so many knocks. You can just see how they are whittling away at just the public image of the Constitution, where they are trying to make the Constitution look like it's always an obstacle to the serious politics of the day. That it's the legal framework that's holding us back, and we just need to we could be much more radical, we could be much more pragmatic if the Constitution would just get out of our way. When it's actually the betrayal of the Constitution that has allowed this to go on for so long, because what the government has been allowed to do more radical things, to double down on its own failed policy, and the lines just keep on being redrawn, and then they say, well, the Constitution is in our way, and then the Constitution gets scapegoated. When, fundamentally, it's the government's fault, and if the government can't deliver, then it must, but it's just always given more powers and more lifelines to run roughshod on basic fundamental rights. Which have been infringed in the Promotion of Equality Act. But it hasn't been properly constitutionally tested. Anyway, I'm going to stop repeating myself, but that finishes off that. So this is why I say that it doesn't mean anything to the constitutional value of non-racialism to try to give someone extra punishment for saying naughty words. That's not what hate speech should be about. My fundamental view is that hate speech is really a kind of soft cultural authoritarianism, which, because this is what happens with all this fascistic buzzwords and all this fascistic moral normalization. The morality of fascism and the worldview of fascism has been so politically normalized that you end up then getting such weak legislation like this that is so fundamentally unprincipled. So it's not grounded in any of its targets. It's not, in some senses, just trying to add more ammunition to criminuria when it's not even trying to do what it should be doing, which is control the outrageous political conflagration and inflammation of disgusting racialist anti-constitutional propaganda. And it does not promote non-racialism. The hate speech bill does nothing to prohibit non-racialism, to promote non-racialism and prohibit the ideological enemies of non-racialism. And so it's I would call this an incredibly missed opportunity. But obviously the state of South African legislation, the state of South African law and politics is obviously so far off course, is so far beyond, it's already exceeded the bounds of all, it's gone so far beyond the actual framing of the Constitution. It's so unconstitutional and unlawful in so many of its details and aspects and developed jurisprudence that we sit in such an institutionally corrupted system that yeah. So I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, when I'm saying that it's a missed opportunity, it's a missed opportunity in the context that we're already very far out of where we're so far past, uh, any kind of salvageable sort of vicinity of reasonableness. Anyway.